Hello and welcome to another edition of the Official Visit podcast. I am Andrew Greif of the Oregonian, beat reporter covering the Oregon Ducks. We don't have Tyson Alger today, but we do have a guest in Andrew Nemec, the Oregonian's recruiting writer, and we're talking today with him because Justin Herbert is the expected starter for the Oregon Ducks Saturday when they play Washington at Autzen Stadium. Number 5 Washington. Kind of a big challenge for a true freshman quarterback, but that appears to be the case with Justin Herbert expected to be the starter. He's from Sheldon High School. He was a big star locally, a multi-sport star. But Andrew Nemec was kind of high on him when he was being recruited, and I thought he'd taken the long view on Herbert a while ago and kind of thought that he would be a star at a Pac-12 school. And this apparently is his chance. So Andrew, first of all, thanks for bringing up the idea of wanting to talk about Herbert. And what can you tell us about why you're not probably that shocked that he's getting a chance right now as a true freshman?
Well, he's extremely talented. I mean, you're looking at a kid who was a 3-sport star, helped Sheldon win a state championship in baseball, led him to the state semifinals in football, also played basketball, and he just kind of got lost in the shuffle. He broke his leg as a junior, I believe in the second or third game of the year, and just in those 2 games, you were seeing a kid who's 6'6", 6'5", runs the ball extremely well for his size, an incredible pocket passer as well. And yet, again, kind of that dual threat quarterback because of his ability to run. He breaks his leg, and people kind of forget about him. The other big thing is because he wanted to play 3 sports, he didn't do the 7-on-7 circuit that we've seen grow and build momentum for recruits over the last few years. I went to the Elite 11 that summer, and it wasn't a great quarterback crop. They invite 18 or 19 of the best quarterbacks in the nation, and then they pick the top 11, and that's the Elite 11 quarterbacks. They've been doing it for years. It's the number 1 quarterback camp in America. And I left that thinking, Justin Herbert probably would have finished in the top 5 or 6 in that group. That really says something because every single kid there is either a high 3-star or better. Most are 4 and 5 stars. And I would have put him in that bubble 4 or 5-star category. Then as a senior, he really shines. And we see him, again, lead his team to the state semifinals. He's a very, very talented passer. You saw him in the state semifinals, and I saw the first game, and the first game had Tim Tawa, who's the 2-time Gatorade Player of the Year. Not a lot of velocity on the ball when compared to Justin Herbert. Now, Tim Tawa has broken the state record for passing yards, for career passing touchdowns, and yet it was a night and day difference watching Tim Tawa as a quarterback and Herbert. He has incredible zip on his passes. You can almost hear it hissing from the crowd. I mean, he's exactly what you want in a quarterback, and he's a kid that really, unfortunately, was overlooked. Unfortunately for the Ducks, it was a guy they could keep in their own backyard. He only had an offer from Northern Arizona, and then Oregon offered, and he committed. So Oregon found themselves a sleeper and a gem, I think.
I was going through Herbert's recruiting page on a couple different recruiting websites the last couple days, and I saw that he had at least maybe some interest from Washington. Maybe took an unofficial up there. Do you remember anything about Washington at all being even slightly interested in Herbert?
Yeah, he was hearing from Pac-12 schools, and as the process went on, it just kind of never materialized for him. It was a really strange thing because you see this kid in person and go, wow, you'd have to imagine that if people got eyes on him, they'd really fall in love with him. And yet all these Pac-12 schools, I think, kind of felt like he either can be our late offer because there's not a lot of attention on him, or we don't even have to offer him and we might get him as a walk-on. Now, that sounds crazy when you're talking about an elite quarterback, but we see that time and time again. If a kid doesn't have that first offer, and obviously he had Northern Arizona, but I'm talking about FBS big-time offer.
Right.
Teams will try to slow play, and they'll try to kind of add him as a late walk-on or maybe a gray shirt, and especially at the quarterback spot so much, they don't want to miss, so they want as many stars next to that name as possible. They want everyone in agreement that, hey, this is the next big guy. And that wasn't really there with Herbert because the recruiting services didn't love him, didn't really get a chance to see him. And so you were really taking a gamble offering him a scholarship. Oregon really didn't look like they were going to offer, but after losing a couple guys, finishing second and third for a couple of athletes, they decided to throw him an offer, and it's looking like it's going to pan out. I've put on him really early. Lamar Winston was a U.S. Army All-American nominee. Didn't get selected for the game, but was a nominee, was a 4-star recruit, offers from Michigan and USC. And in my final rankings, I had Herbert significantly ahead of Winston, several spots ahead of Winston. Just really kind of a surprising way in which we've got all this media attention on recruiting, and yet school's still kind of taking an archaic approach, allows a kid like Justin Herbert, who, again, I had like a 4.5 kind of star grade on, slips all the way through.
How you can speak to this better than I can, but it's really curious because the guy who he's potentially about to unseat, Dakota Prukop, when he was in high school and actually after high school in college at Montana State first, he would do the private quarterback coach route. He went with George Whitfield out of San Diego. He'd paid himself to go down there. They work out on the beach. Whitfield's really, really well known. You've probably seen him on College Game Day. There are a lot of guys like that. Travis Johnson on Oregon's roster, he had a private coach too that he was tutored by outside of his high school. And so I think it's interesting how Herbert, he shows that you can do this doing a different way. You can still get to the Pac-12. It's probably harder in some ways because the exposure isn't the same. But, being a 3-sport guy, that's pretty unusual, and yet here he is. I'm just curious, how rare is it to see guys not be specialized at the quarterback position?
Well, we don't see it as much anymore. You're right, and we're seeing kind of a streamlining of the quarterbacks, and I think there's parts of that are really good, and there's parts of that are really negative. Obviously, they're getting elite coaching younger. The problem is kids aren't really being allowed to find their own groove and then learn the finer points. Do you know what I mean? They're being corrected almost before they develop kind of what their natural body instincts are to do.
Yep.
And so you've got guys that aren't necessarily allowed to blossom their own way before being refined. Herbert blossomed his own way and is kind of just now being refined. I think it's too early for him to be the starter, to be honest. As much as I like him, as talented as he is, it's really hard to go from Sheldon High School, where they were beating teams consistently 56-0, 70-7, and he was only playing the first half and sitting, to playing against a Washington defense as his first start that's number 1 in sacks, arguably one of the best defenses in the country. I think it's a big ask for him this early. It would have been nice, I think, for him to get a few more series leading into this, and then maybe even share time with Prukop, let Prukop start against Washington before giving him the reins coming out of the bye week. I think Oregon fans, as much as I've just gushed about him, obviously I think he's a very talented player and will develop into a very, very good football player for Oregon. I think he's going to struggle early. We saw in that first drive, he's got poise, he's got pocket presence. You saw him roll out and run for that touchdown. He's got awareness. But the game's going to speed up when you compare it to Washington State's backups to what he's going to face as far as Washington and their starting lineup. Like I said, it would have been nice for him to get the start coming out of the bye rather than kind of being thrown into the mix with not a lot of experience.
What you mean that 9 total snaps in your career isn't enough to go into the nation's number 2 sack defense? Come on.
Yeah, it's tough. And, again, we talk about how great he is, and I've talked about how much I like him, and I obviously think he's fantastic, but it's really tough for any true freshman to start at all. And I'm talking about even when you start the season against, whoever you're going to play early in the year when you're playing non-conference foes, let alone such a big game with 12 years of winning on the line and a 3-game losing streak for Oregon. He grew up in Eugene, so he's playing in front of, not just the home crowd, but like literally the home crowd. He's playing in front of his hometown. I can't imagine a much bigger stage to drop a true freshman into with all the things that are circling this Oregon program. To me, it feels a little bit, and I know other writers at the Oregonian have talked about this a little bit, feels like a little bit of a panic move for Helfrich. That being said, with as ineffective as Prukop has been, we see him throwing off his back foot even when he's got time. We see him scrambling into trouble rather than scrambling out of trouble. I think it makes sense from an X's and O's standpoint. If they were video game players, maybe Herbert's an overall 80 right now and Prukop's an overall 78 or something like that, so maybe Herbert's a slight upgrade. But when you're dealing with what he's going to have to deal with as a true freshman, like I said, I think it's a big ask.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you there. It's, there's been the school of thought that, well, if Oregon's season is kind of headed south after 3 straight losses, why not get the youth movement underway right now? Maybe Helfrich can present a case to his bosses that, look, all the youth I'm putting in here, like I deserve more time. There's all that involved, but at the heart of it is you're going to put a true freshman most likely against a really rabid defense that had 8 sacks last week in Stanford without blitzing once. I mean, I'm really curious to see how they take the heat off him. One thing that we didn't really get to see a whole lot of against Washington State, because again, he only played 8 snaps. He led him to an 85-yard touchdown drive. But his running ability, we talked about the broken leg, but we know that he's a really good basketball player too. What kind of a runner do you remember him as being? He's not going to be a beat you in a straight line type of guy, is my estimation. But how good is he in terms of escaping pressure, whether in the pocket or out in the open field?
Now, I'm going to get a lot of criticism for this, and I know it ahead of time. I am not comparing him overall as this level of player.
Oh, good.
But in terms of running style, what to expect from him. If you can remember kind of what Andrew Luck was at Stanford, he wasn't necessarily a guy that was looking to run first, and he wasn't a speedster. He wasn't Dennis Dixon. But what he did was he almost ran with like a fullback's mentality and was able to roll out at times and get that first down and get out of bounds or run over some people at times. I think there's a relatively famous message board clip now of Herbert flatbacking an Oregon linebacker on his way to the goal line on a run from fall camp. And I think don't expect him to be doing that with regularity against Washington's defense, but he's definitely that guy that in pressure he can roll out. He's smart enough to make that decision, maybe run and fall forward while he's being hit by a corner and gain 7 or 8. Don't expect him to have 150-yard games at Oregon, even against poor opponents. He's not that type of runner, but he is the type of guy that can get you out of trouble and get 40 to 50 yards in a game, especially in goal line situations. He could be a guy that definitely just keeps the ball in his hands for some keepers to cross the goal line.
Yeah. Maybe this is apples to oranges, but there's not a ton of blue chip quarterbacks that come out of Oregon that go on to like big schools, but can you compare him like maybe the last, 3 or 4 years that you've been watching Oregon preps heavily with the Oregonian, like a guy like Eric Dungy, like I don't know, like is Herbert really one of the best to come out of the state in a while?
It's so tough. I think his ceiling is incredibly high because of the arm strength, because of his pocket presence, because of his ability to take off and run. Eric Dungy was kind of another weird one. Overlooked. I know I had written and said a number of times I thought Oregon State should give him a look because of how mobile he was. Eric Dungy was weird. I went to a quarterback camp, Taylor Barton quarterback camp, and when Dungy wasn't throwing his snaps and they were running 40-yard go routes and hitting the guy in the end zone, he had like 3 or 4 of the best quarterbacks in the state all working out. When Dungy wasn't doing his reps, he lined up at receiver and was one-handing the ball 40 yards downfield in the end zone. It was just incredible. He's such a freak athlete. Very different styles. What you're getting in Herbert and what I've seen from Herbert is kind of a kid who naturally, and whether it's baseball, basketball, football, we always say he gets it. He's a kid that gets it. He knows situationally, okay, it's time to tuck the ball and get to 3 yards, or I need to really spin this one in and fire this one in there in a small window. And that makes him very different than what we've seen in quarterbacks in the last few years in Oregon, is that kind of situationally, he's at least a B+ in every area, running, short passes, deep passes, arm strength, pocket presence, and then kind of an A+ kid, kind of an A+ human being. It's always scary to compare a kid character-wise to Marcus, but I think Marcus Mariota, but in terms of not getting himself in trouble, being a kid that his teammates believe in, he's got a little bit of that to him where he's almost that, oh shucks, good kid. And I think that's a nice quality that he has, again, that separates him from past Oregon quarterbacks. He's just a remarkable kid.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to let you out of here on this one. Put yourself in the position of like an Oregon player this week, a teammate of Herbert. Are you excited to see what the kid has, against some live fire after 2 months of, apparently really good practice? Are you feeling like the coaching staff is maybe throwing up a little bit of a white flag? What's your gut instinct about the move like this? I'll tell you my take is that I think it's a little bit of both. That they're kind of like, well, this is bad if we're turning in some ways to the true freshman, but it's also kind of exciting because, obviously Dakota was good but couldn't put us over the top in some instances. I'm thinking of deep balls. So maybe why not? Let's just see what happens. I think it's you can see the pluses and the minuses of the decision if I were on the team. But I'm curious about yours too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, if you're a senior, you're kind of like, dang it, I wish Pruka could have been another Vernon Adams, and we could have put together a nice, had he stayed healthy, who knows what Oregon would have done last year. I'm sure the senior class is like, man, we wish Prukop could have stayed healthy and been that Vernon Adams guy and been great all the way through. But at the same time, I think there's, we saw some of the body language start to show, especially with Darren Carrington. There's frustration on this team with the way the ball's being delivered. And I'll give this to Herbert. I don't think he's the type of guy who's going to miss wide open receivers. If anything, he's going to underthrow to make sure it gets caught. He's savvy like that. But I just think the receivers were starting to show some signs of body language that maybe it was time for a change. I did want to touch on one other thing, actually, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Go.
I talked to Colson Yankoff. He's a 2018 quarterback commit from Oregon. He's the number 6 dual threat quarterback in the country. He shared time in Idaho at Coeur d'Alene High School last year with a senior that was an all-state player, not a big-time prospect, but a true leader. And the coaching staff just felt like we go with the senior ahead of the freshman, sophomore type kid. And he said he's not worried about Justin Herbert, a freshman, coming in and playing right away in terms of how it would affect potentially his commitment. There's a 2-year gap between them. Obviously, he wouldn't be coming to Oregon for another whole year. He's only a junior in high school. And said really he's anxious to see what Herbert can do. He wants to watch and see what happens with this coaching staff. But in terms of losing his commitment, and it would be a big one, he's the number 6 dual threat quarterback and hasn't really played much, which means the limited time he has played, even in the state of Idaho, he's absolutely blown scouts away. We could be talking about a 4- and 5-star talented kid. He feels pretty comfortable saying, I'd like to see what a young quarterback can do, in part because I think if Herbert can do well in this situation, that means potentially I could do well down the road, given the chance to play early. So not a major concern that a freshman would be taking the reins early at Oregon.
And just on you wrote about, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Rutger Reitmeier?
Rutger Reitmeier, yeah.
Okay, so he's like the All-American defensive lineman, a commit for Oregon for this upcoming 2017 class, and he was not all that worried about how Oregon has started 2-3. Have you talked to more recruits? Is that generally the thought of of course we don't want to see this team lose many more games, but maybe I'm not ready to yank my commitment?
Sure. I wrote a column about this today. Tuesday. So this podcast might come out Wednesday. So yesterday. And the general consensus, and I talked to 10 to 12 over the weekend, and then another couple on Monday of recruits, and that was commits and targets. The thing about high school kids, they don't watch football as closely as you'd think. I would say it was my biggest shocker of a takeaway in the time I've been doing this recruiting beat at the Oregonian. These kids are busy. Some of them are sore. Some of them Saturdays, their only day off from football. They've got Monday through Friday practice. They've got Sunday film session. Monday's their relaxed day, so they want to go hang out with their friends. Overwhelmingly, the response I got from recruits was, Oregon's usually pretty good. I'm not that surprised they're 2-3 because they can always turn it around and win out, kind of like they did last year. I don't think recruits are fully aware of the rebuild that Oregon might be in. I asked the recruits, what would you do if they went 4-8, 5-7? And almost every single guy to a prospect said, well, I don't think that's going to happen. And so while fans are kind of in the realm of like, hey, probably Oregon's not making a bowl game, this year's going to be a rebuild year, a struggling year, recruits aren't ready to go there yet. I think you're going to have to see a couple more losses on the board, if that happens, before recruits are really willing to give you a vibe of where they're at. I've only had one recruit that would even be willing to answer, how would you feel if they went 4-8? And it was kind of like, man, I don't know, it would really change things for me because I want to go somewhere that wins. Like I said, most recruits see Oregon as a perennial Pac-12 school. They lost to now ranked Colorado and ranked Nebraska. And so they're not real concerned quite yet.
Yeah. Well, that'll be something worth monitoring, obviously, down the stretch because it'll be fascinating to see where Oregon goes from here. Now that they're already 2-3 and a possible 4th loss on the horizon with a very, very strong Washington team. Can't count it out yet, Arizona hung with them, of course, on the road not that long ago. So you never know. But very interesting to see how recruits react and how young Master Herbert reacts as well. Andrew, thank you very much for the insight today.
Thank you.